Today's guest is Dr. Salim Faraji, and here's one of his books, The Roots of Nubian Christianity Uncovered, The Triumph of the Last Pharaoh. And he's an expert on Nubia, Kush, and Miro, and all of those places along the Nile. And here he is, good picture of him, and he has a creation story there in the background, and here's his book again. Now, this is the book that I want to get, The Origin of the Word Amen.
Yes.
That will go over well at Wose Community.
Mm-hmm.
The origin of that word. Let me read your bio, Dr. Faraji. Dr. Salim Faraji is professor and former chair of Africana Studies at California State University, Dominguez Hills. He is also the founding executive director of the Masters of Arts in International Studies African program at Concordia University, Irvine in Ghana, West Africa. He completed his Master's of Divinity at Claremont School of Theology and an MA and a PhD at Claremont Graduate University. He is a member of the International Society for Nubian Studies and specializes in early Christian history, Africana and Africanist historiography, and Coptic studies, the Kerma, Nabatean, Meroic, and medieval periods of Nubian history. He has presented papers on Nubian Christianity at the 11th International Conference of Meroic Studies in Vienna, Austria, and the 12th and 13th International Conferences for Nubian Studies at the British Museum and the University de Neuchâtel, Switzerland. I hope I said that right.
Yes.
More recently, Dr. Faraji presented the ascendancy of the Kushite kingdom of Kerma in the post-Middle Kingdom era, revisiting the second intermediate period of ancient Egypt at the 14th International Conference for Nubian Studies at the University of Paris, Sorbonne, Louvre Museum. He is also a founding member of the Nubian Language Society and one of a handful of Nubiologists in the United States and the only Africana studies scholar in the country who is a Coptic studies specialist. Professor Faraji is a contributor to Romans, Barbarians, and the Transformation of the Roman World, the Encyclopedia of African Religion, the Oxford Dictionary of African Biography, and the author of The Roots of Nubian Christianity Uncovered, The Triumph of the Last Pharaoh. He has traveled and worked extensively on the African continent in such nations as Ghana, Burkina Faso, Egypt, Ethiopia, Namibia, both as a scholar and an activist humanitarian. Dr. Faraji of the Amun-Ra Theological Seminary will now discuss towards an African spiritual renaissance. And, just listening to it was a talk that you were doing. Here he is at the Nubian Museum. I got to make it over there the next time I'm at that part of the world.
In Egypt.
In Egypt. But I want to, I was listening to you on YouTube today, and I was listening to you pull all the pieces of the Nile Valley and connecting the Sahel region and going all the way to West Africa. And I wanted to read this quote. This is one of the holy books of Wose Community, and it's by Ayikwe Arma. You're probably familiar,
Yes.
2000 Seasons. But this is right on page 1, and it says, "Pieces cut off from the whole are nothing but dead fragments. From the unending stream of our remembrance, the harbingers of death break off meaningless fractions. Their carriers bring us news of shards. Their message, behold this paltriness, This is all your history. Beware the destroyers. It is their habit to cut off fingers from the hand itself, uproot it from its parent body, calling each fallen piece a creature in itself, different from ears, eyes, noses, feet, entrails, other individual creatures of their making. Is it a wonder we have been flung so far from the way, that our people are scattered even into the desert, across the sea, over and away from this land, and we have forgotten how to recognize ourselves? I'm very happy to have our speaker come in and tell us about. Let me get this. Let me get the topic right. He's going to discuss towards an African spiritual renaissance. Uh, Take it away, brother, and let me make you a host so that you can share your screen. And we're excited. We're blessed to have you join us today.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation, Minister Kebulon. It's good to be here. And let me say this. I've been an admirer from a distance of Wose Community Church for a very long time. I first heard about the church when I was still living on the East Coast, my hometown in Philadelphia, right? Everyone heard about Wose Community Church, even back east, especially in African Center circles and so forth, because of the work that you all were doing and continue to do, being a pioneer and cutting edge in that regard. So I just wanted to say that. And in fact, when one of my colleagues, is, Dr. Lawson Bush, Nana Kweku Bakan, I mentioned to him that I was doing this today. He said, "Well, say," he said, "Wow, they've been around for a minute, right?" I said, "Yeah, I think it's I think it's over 30 years, 35 years, right?"
You know what? We just celebrated our 40th anniversary this past December.
All right, so 40 years.
Yeah.
40 years, 40 years. And so I just want to commend and congratulate this institution for persevering and being persistent and being a cradle and an incubator of our culture, our values, our knowledge, our history, disseminating to the people and empowering people, right? Because that's beautiful. And what I'm going to talk about today, um, you all are going to see, and we know this already, that what you all have been doing, and other institutions as well, actually represents the future. When you all were founded 40 years ago, you were already in the future. You were already pointing the forward way and direction of our next metamorphosis in this country and around the world, right? And we're going to see that today. I just want to say that because the presentation I prepared today, you told me you saw my presentation at Pacific School of Religion at UC Berkeley, the presentation on Kush and Kerma, and so forth. And so the presentation today is not going to be so much a historical presentation or archaeological presentation the way that one was. You are an established institution, an established a religious community and society that is dedicated and devoted to cultivating African people through our values, our culture, our spirituality, and history. So I prepared a presentation to speak to you all, ourselves, as theological leaders, as spiritual leaders, as religious leaders, as midwives, so to speak, who are responsible for this transformation, this metamorphosis, this renaissance that we must have. So I'm going to share my screen very quickly. Where is it? Okay, am I right here? All right.
We can see it. Yes.
You all can see it. Let me okay. All right. So, toward an African Renaissance or an African spiritual Renaissance. Um, you all may or may not be familiar. I'm sure you are. Um, Dr. Henry Louis Gates, right, professor of African American Studies, Harvard, um, produced a documentary that came on last night, at least the first part, right? I don't know if you all are familiar with that. The
Is this
document,
the one on the Black church?
one on the Black church, right?
Okay. Yes.
The Black church, this is our story, this is our song. And the documentary chronicled the history and the evolution and development of the Black church tradition in the United States. Um, it touched on briefly. It could have done more on the African spiritual roots of the Black church and the African traditional religion. It didn't go deep into that, but it had to give a nod to it and so forth. And then where it concluded last night, I think, was just after Reconstruction era. So part two will deal with Reconstruction up until, I guess, the president and so forth. Um, I'm only bringing it up because many people in church circles or just in African American culture has been shaped by the Black church tradition are talking about this, right? And for me, the question also is where do we go from here? Where do we go now? Black religion in the US, the Black church in the US, African American religion, African diaspora religions, right? Santeria, Vodou, and Candomblé, African traditional religion on the African continent, the African church on the African continent, which is a powerful and ubiquitous institution in Ghana, but elsewhere throughout Africa, right? I'm just describing how it is, not necessarily how it could be or how it should be, but I'm assessing the situation, right? Because that's an assessment. An assessment is what is the account of the entity or phenomena as it stands now, right? And this is where we are now. And so it's in that light that I want to talk about how do we move toward an African spiritual renaissance and how the World Saved Community Church, which has already been doing this work for 40 years, can continue to do this work another 40 and another 50 or 140 years to participate in this movement, this spiritual transformation. Okay, okay, there you go. All right, I want to begin with this gentleman. May he rest in peace. Dr. Gay Rod Wilmore. I should have had his name there, but I believe I missed it. But Dr. Gay Rod Wilmore was a prominent and preeminent Black church historian and Black church theologian. He did a lot of work with James Cone, right? James Cone was one of the architects or progenitors, fathers of Black liberation theology, Black theology in the United States in the late 60s, contemporary with Albert Cleage, right? Who was also involved in that work. And so Dr. Wilmore co-edited the Black Liberation Theology volumes 1 and 2. He also wrote his book, Black Religion and Black Radicalism, and other work, right? He just recently passed, I believe he passed April last year. So it hasn't even been a year since he passed. And I believe Dr. Wilmore was in his 90s, right? The reason why I'm sharing this quote, because I came across this quote, I don't know, maybe 25, 30 years ago. I was in seminary in the mid 1990s. I began at Howard University Divinity School, and then I transferred to Southern California, Claremont School of Theology, Claremont Graduate University. But this quote has always, it has left an indelible mark in my spirit about where we need to go. And let me also say that in this book, Black Religion and Black Radicalism, This quote actually comes from the very last part of the book entitled The Future. So this is why I said that we'll say has already been in the future, because Dr. Wilmore in 1983, and I just had the 1983 edition, I believe it came out even before 1983, right? In 1983, in the last chapter of his book entitled The Future, what is the future of Black religion? What is the future of the Black church? What is it we must do? What is it we must forge to mature and evolve into our spirituality and to recognize our humanity and the dignity of our ancestors, right? And so he said, Afro-Americans are not only a spiritual people, but also an African people. We need to know what ancient and modern Africans have to contribute to our knowledge of God and the survival and liberation of the human race, ancient and modern, for ourselves and for the entire planet, is what he's saying. The question of African religious connections, where to renew it within the structure of the Black church, and how to justify it may be difficult. And he's right, because many of my colleagues, even in my lifetime, right, are not all, but many are resistant to this endeavor. They're resistant to this imperative of the future that he laid out. Even knowing the history, even knowing the history, even knowing the archaeology, even knowing the documentation, even knowing the foundation of all human spirituality begins on the African continent, even knowing that, still resistant, right? He says it's difficult, but it may be difficult, but it is still possible and desirable to try to recover some of the great enduring values of the traditional religions of Africa for the revitalization of Afro-American religion in the United States. 1983, he's saying this, that African traditional religion can revitalize not only the Black church, but Black religion, African religion throughout the world. But only the theologians of the Black churches may be reasonably be expected to take such an initiative seriously and to do something with it. And so tonight, toward an African spiritual renaissance, we have our imperative, we have our initiative. It is the recovering and excavation of African spirituality, African traditional religions and value, emphasizing the humanity, power, the vision, science, the metaphysics, right, of these spiritual systems that have been maligned, that have been denied, that have been misrepresented as pagan and witchcraft and so forth, right? He says the initiative that lies before us is recovering the depths of African traditional religions, right? And again, mind you, this is Dr. Wilmore was an esteemed theologian and historian of the Black church tradition. I just wanted to begin there, and let me also say this. This is even beyond quote unquote religion and spirituality per se. Because African traditional cultures, African indigenous cultures, as we know, did not understand themselves as religions. They understood themselves as culture, as a way of life, as a human orientation. So they informed all aspects of life. So what's at stake is not only the revitalization of religion, but it's the revitalization of the totality of human knowledge and human sciences, right? This is really what we are talking about, because these cultures informed medicine, philosophy, science, music, agriculture, right? Statecraft, governance, economic issues, political issues, right? This simply was not religion. It's just a culture. In fact, many, many years ago, uh, a Ghanaian woman steeped in tradition checked me, right? And I was just speaking flippantly. I mean, I understand this intellectually, but she checked me, right? I might have used the word religion. She said, stop saying religion. This is not religion. This is culture. And this is the highest manifestation of human culture, right? This is what she said. So really, this is the initiative, right? Not only recovering African traditional spirituality, indigenous values for religion per se, right? But for the entire human endeavor in science, in knowledge, and even today, what we call STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and so forth, right? And so for many people, when we think of African spirituality, who have been misinformed by the Western representation of our spiritual traditions, we can't even put together STEM and African indigenous systems, right? But who invented STEM? Who created STEM? Who pioneered science, right? You know, so tell that to Ibe Madupe, who's an astrophysicist from the San people, so-called Kun people of Southern Africa, who's an astrophysicist, and he said it was San culture and San traditions in Southern Africa that inspired him to become an astrophysicist. In other words, his interest in science was prompted by the stellar cosmology and stories that the San people have been telling for 300,000 years. This prompted his scientific curiosity, right? And so this is what is at stake, right? The revitalization of our culture, our humanity, and the reclamation of our power, right? As African people. How many of you all have seen this documentary? Right? Um,
I have to say, I have not seen this. It looks very interesting.
Look, this, oh, I love it. This is one of my go-to, and again, one of my colleagues, the same brother I mentioned earlier, Dr. Lawson Bush V, Nana Kweku Bakan, he's an Akomfo trained in Ghana. He and I trained with the same Akomfo in Ghana. He's been practicing now for about 10, 12 years. And he hits me up one night, yo, Salim, check this out. It's on Amazon Prime, right? And so I viewed it several times. We all know Jaimon Hunsu, right? Hollywood actor, indigenous to Benin, right? Uh, Born and raised in Benin. In the video, he says his name means the child. His name, Jaimon, means the child, or his family name, Hunsu, maybe his family name, Hunsu means one who was born of the shrine, right? The portal in which we commune with the ancestors in the spirit world, right? Of course, we know him from Amistad all the way to more recent movies, right? He's been around in Hollywood for a very long time. And he did this maybe about a year ago. It's a powerful documentary. He is representing the beauty and the power, the dignity and the depth of Vodun or voodoo from Benin, right? Now, I want to share some quick quotes that he says in this, right? Again, just building on the ancestor, Dr. Gay Rod Wilmore, who said that we must take seriously the initiative of recovering African traditional religion and spirituality for ourselves and for all of humanity. And so, in his way, in his contribution, Jaimon Hunsu is contributing to this endeavor. Here's what he says in the film. Very, very powerful and deep and compelling man, a respect for his own ancestral, and not only ancestral, but living traditions and spirituality. He says, voodoo is the channel between humanity and the forces of nature. Voodoo is the channel between humanity and the forces of nature. We know in African spirituality, whether or not we're talking about the Abosun, whether or not we're talking about the Netaru, whether we're talking about the Vodou, the Loa, the Orisha, we know that these are forces of nature, intelligences within nature, right? And we know that nature is sacred. It's not the anthropological category of animism, right? That Western ethnographers and anthropologists have pinned on African spirituality. We're talking about the very forces of nature that sustain and guide our existence, and the portals between the human, who is also a force of nature, the human who's also an aspect of nature, right? The neter in the Kemetic tradition, right? He says voodoo is the channel between humanity and the forces of nature. It is knowledge of the mastery of nature. Easily, this premise and worldview can be extended to so many different fields and disciplines in knowledge. Certainly medicine, of course, health, well-being, certainly physics, certainly astronomy, certainly agriculture, right? So we're talking about communing and interacting and living in harmony with the forces of nature as an aspect of nature ourselves. He's not done. I have two more quotes because there's others, but I encourage you all. It's on Amazon Prime. He says, voodoo is a gateway of the consciousness of the planet's first people.
Wow.
Diamond Hunsu.
Wow.
Voodoo is a gateway into the consciousness of our planet's first people. We know that the indigenous traditions of Africa are the oldest Aboriginal traditions on the planet, and that certainly Africans emerged, the African continent millions and thousands of years ago populated the entire globe, right? Are the Aboriginal indigenous people of the planet, the continent, but also the planet. In the worldview and practices that emerged out of this culture was a profound respect for nature and the cosmos and living in harmony with it. And he says voodoo gives us a lens into the consciousness, the spirituality, the culture of the planet's first people, the Aboriginal people of the planet. At the very end of the documentary, right, and it's so rich, I'm only touching on just a few aspects. At the end of the documentary, he talks about how, and this is the charge that Wilmore is talking about, he talks about how we must institutionalize our spirituality, traditions, and culture. It has to be institutionalized and studied and practiced seriously, right? So he says, and the science behind this has to be materialized and institutionalized somewhere. We need a definite place in society to teach the practices of voodoo and other African traditional religious and spiritual systems. He says we need chairs, chairs of African spirituality right? Let's say at the University of Namibia, Namibia University of Science and Technology, University of Ghana, University of Botswana, University of Zimbabwe, right? You all follow me. Others, Dakar, Dakar, Senegal. He says we need chairs, endowed chairs who specialize in the study of voodoo and other African indigenous spiritual systems. We must institutionalize and materialize our traditions for our societies, ourselves, and the planet. Right? Again, this
Yes.
is in alignment with the quote that we began with Gay Rod Wilmore. How do we take that imperative and that initiative seriously and create an African spiritual renaissance, right? Where we're free from the fear that has prevented us from immersing ourselves in our spirituality, right? Because our spirituality in the continent, it is our inheritance and it is our redemption. There's another. Have you all seen this? This is on YouTube. Former mayor of Atlanta, former ambassador. He spoke at my university about 2 or 3 months ago. My university brought him out at Cal State Dominguez Hills, Southern California, LA area. And I attended courses during the pandemic, so it was virtual. And I had the opportunity to ask him why, at this stage in your life, Ambassador Young, why did you decide to do a documentary on the power of African traditional healing? Who's seen these two documentaries, 1 and 2? Right, they're on YouTube. I teach a course at Cal State Dominguez Hills. It's cross-listed, the Africana Studies Department and our Philosophy Department. And so these 2 videos, among others, these 2 videos are on my course syllabus, right? Students have to watch these videos. It's powerful. Let me just say this, and I'm not probably the best person to talk about it, but about a year ago, Dr. Charles Finch, right? Y'all know Dr. Charles Finch, out of Atlanta, right? Morehouse College, and the work that he's done over the past 30, 40 years. I hung out with him when he came, had the opportunity, you all know how that is, had the opportunity to pick him up from the airport, take him to his hotel. So we were talking. And he was basically schooling me, right? Because he's an elder and he's kind of been there and done that. And so Morehouse School of Medicine has actually been on the ground in Senegal since the 80s. And Dr. Finch was a part of those endeavors. In fact, I think he was the one who initiated it, if I'm not mistaken. So they've been dealing with a doctor, I'm trying to remember his name, it may come to me, in a healing institute there in Senegal. The names are evading me now, but it'll come to me. And someone who's listening remembers it, just feel free to say it. But again, he is laying out the power of African traditional healing, the power of African medicine. Now we know African medicine. Its earliest documentation is ancient Kemet, Egypt, whether it's the Edwin Smith papyrus, right, which I encourage all of our medical students to study. One of my colleagues, he has 2 daughters. One is in medical school and the other is pre-med. And we're like, okay, yeah, they're going to do the conventional medical school education, right? But we want to make sure they have copies of all of the ancient Egyptian medical papyri, right? So that it informs their understanding of medicine, because the way medicine is done now can be documented, of course, in ancient Kemet, ancient Kush, right? Egypt, Nubia, but not only that, all over Africa, the traditional healers, right? Their botanical knowledge, their pharmacological knowledge, their their herbal knowledge and so forth. In fact, there's a sister, I forget her name, out of UC Berkeley. She wrote a book called Bitter Roots, something to that degree, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And she talks about basically just the history of African medicine and biopiracy. International corporate conglomerates coming into the continent attempting to steal Africa's medicinal, herbal, and botanical knowledge, right? And so, Senator Young has given us a gift with this documentary, and anyone who's serious about this dimension of African culture, right, is able to take this and run with it. And so again, you know, Jaimon Hunsu, he says, look, this is nature. That's physics. That's mathematics. That's chemistry, biology, astronomy. This is medicine. You know, and one of the you all see once you watch this, one of the discoveries is that they took one of the herbs to the military medical lab in Maryland, the DC area, and they tested it, and they saw that it killed the HIV virus. Right, all that is in this video. Right, they tested.
I don't want to take you on a tangent.
Sure.
I tend to do that with my questions.
Okay.
But since you're in this part, are you familiar with Iboga?
Iboga?
Yeah, it's also Ibogaine. It is it's like ayahuasca.
Okay.
And I think this is in I forget the West African country now, but people take it. You know, you don't have to keep taking it. They take it one time, and they're off drugs.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. I've heard of it. Yes.
Okay. I don't mean for you to go, you know, on a tangent, but I just thought I'd ask.
No. Thank you. Yeah. I clipped an article about maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And the article might have been in it was in an African business magazine. And it was comparing the industry, so to speak, of Chinese medicine and African medicine. The article was talking about the similarities between the two. Of course, the big difference, the article said, the big difference is that, if I can use this word, the brand of Chinese holistic health and medicine is globally and internationally popular. Someone says Tai Chi, you know what they're talking about, right? Someone, you know, someone says Qigong, right? We know in other aspects of Chinese medicine and holistic health and so forth. And so, but the article is saying that African holistic medicine and medicinal, botanical, pharmacological knowledge has the potential to be on that level internationally, right? Of course, in the popular imagination, folk are thinking witchcraft, right? Folk are thinking evil, diabolical, satanic. Right? There's a Chinese herbal store. I live near Cal State Dominguez is near a city called Gardena in Southern California, right outside LA. And there's a Chinese community and Japanese in Gardena, right? Japanese been there for a long time. They got Buddhist temples and so forth there. And so there's a Chinese merchant that I will go into his store every now and then, right? And he's giving out herbs, plants, and tree bark. I sit and watch it. He put it on the scale. He has a recommendation. He does a diet, and so I'm sitting there. I'm trying to say, okay, what is different about what he's doing? And by the way, he's also a Western trained MD, but he's also steeped in Chinese medicine, which is 5,000 years old, right? And so, but I'm sitting there and I'm saying, okay, what's different about what he's doing and the traditional Dancini, right? The Dancini is the herbalist in the Khan culture. I'm like, what's the difference? Why is it, this one isn't respected and maligned and seen as a quack and witchcraft, witch doctor, while this one is respectable? And the only difference is the value that we place on our own traditions. That's the only difference, right? The Chinese brother, they know the value of their tradition, their medicine, their holistic health and culture. And so what can you say, right? And so the difference is the value and the esteem. And then once we make our mind up on the value of it, the power of it, the dignity of it, then we can start talking about the economic and political will is going to need to really invest and develop it. But none of that can happen. And so what I like about this Ambassador Young is that he's recovering, like Wilmore said in his quote, he's recovering the value of African traditional medicine and healing, right? And so again, this imperative, this initiative of an African spiritual renaissance is not only religious per se, right? We're talking about the totality of human knowledge, human culture. We all know Dr. John Henry Clark. Uh, I want you all, I'm going to read this. I want you all to insert where it says education, right? He wrote education for a new reality in the African world. Education for a new reality in the African world. I want you all to insert theological education, religious education, spiritual education, STEM education, medical education, right? Whatever field, right? You can preface it, right? Because Dr. Clark here was talking about all of it. He was talking about all of it: STEM, natural sciences, arts, agriculture, politics, economic. He's talking about the entire system of how we approach knowledge to benefit humanity, nature, the planet, and so forth. Education for a new reality in the African world must be an education that enables Africans to handle all the wealth producing resources of Africa. Dr. Clark. So the first few slides we began with, well, what is the imperative? What is the initiative? It's an African spiritual renaissance. It's recovering African traditional religion, right? And so we looked at Jai Mohunsu, we looked at Andrew Young, right? But for what purpose? What's the end goal? Dr. Clark says that the education has to be directed. That enables us to handle all of the wealth producing resources of Africa. So that's the uranium. That's the lithium, the bauxite, the diamonds, the gold, the arable farmland, the aluminum, the iron ore, right? An education that enables the African to manage and market these resources, and an education that enables him, her to prepare the generations still to come to do the same thing. I know where we are right now in the US in light of the previous administration, 4 years of that, what happened on January 6th, and then prior to that, the pandemic we've been in, and then even the Black Lives Matter global mobilization in defense of Black humanity because of the death of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others, right? And so that has placed us. I shouldn't say it hasn't placed us, right? But it has kind of reignited this circular conversation about race. And certainly that's a real conversation. I don't want to suggest that it isn't. Right? But it is a futile conversation independent of this conversation right here. It's it's a futile conversation if we're not talking about what Dr. Clark says is the aim, the goal, the target of education. And in the context of this presentation, right, the education of excavating African indigenous cultures, traditions, and values, and so forth. It must lead to this goal, he says. A large number of African children should be chosen at birth and trained toward these ends, and all education should be for the total sovereignty of African people. There is nothing in African traditional values that prohibits modernism and upward mobility or the use of science and technology, right? And so, of course, Dr. Clark was clear on this, right? And so there's some understanding that, if I'm talking about, African traditional, I'm talking about Vodun and Santeria and Candomblé, right? I'm talking about Yoruba traditions, Akan traditions, I'm talking about ancient Kush and Kemet. Somehow that's mutually exclusive with, I'm talking about mining, science and technology and geological sciences. And I just saw an article the other day saying that on the continent and even here, there's a tremendous lack of that. And so we need to be cultivating youth to enter the geological sciences. Why? Because of our material resources. And so there has to be a connection between the excavation and the recovery of African traditional values and spirituality with the aim toward handling and managing our resources, right? Africans must realize that they live in a modern technical world and that there are lessons we can draw from our ancient societies to guide us, right? And so they're in dialogue. My current moment is in dialogue with, right, our traditions. How does it inform that? Right? Cheikh Anta Diop said in, I think it is pre-colonial Black Africa, right? He laid out a plan. He said, look, all of that, help me out, all of the it's on the tip of my tongue. It's the science of using the steam and heat under the earth for power.
Thermodynamics.
He said, look, the whole Horn of Africa and East Africa should be cultivated for thermodynamic energy, right? And who's doing it now? I think the Swiss, Iceland, some other countries.
Excuse me, Dr. Faraji. Are you saying that the Swiss are in Africa using thermodynamics?
Yes, they're investing in developing it. Yes.
Yes, the Chinese also.
Chinese also, yes, without a doubt. Right. And so our spiritual and cultural education must be connected with the ability to manage ourselves, our wealth, our societies, and so forth, right? And really, that's what we saw. I mean, we love Kemet. I love Kemet. I can study and talk about Kemet and Kush forever. But when we study the scientific technological innovation and ingenuity of Kemet around agriculture, around architecture, right, around their economic system, that's exactly what they were doing. We don't see a gulf between, let's say, Chahuti and Shashat and universities. or Ptah and the earth science, right?
Can I ask the question? You know, what you're saying always triggers things in my mind.
Sure.
And so, are you familiar with the power plant at Gabon at a place called Oklu?
In Oakland?
Oklu. So in Gabon,
Oh,
there.
in Gabon. No, I'm not familiar with the one in Gabon. No, no.
I just want to mention that in 1972, France, who gets their uranium from Gabon, received a shipment of uranium that was already used. And so then they investigated, and there's a place called Oklu in Gabon where what a lot of Westerners are saying is a natural nuclear power plant.
Mhm.
But other scientists are pointing out that you can't do it naturally. So what it's saying is that Africans were using nuclear fission 500,000 years ago.
Yes, yes. And you say why? Well, Jaimun Hunsu, voodoo is the channel between humanity and the forces of nature, right? And so that is an ontological statement about the nature of our being. And that is also a technological statement as well, our ability to utilize the natural resources, right? In a way, here's the thing, in a way that is sustainable and doesn't deplete and destroy the planet, right? Uh, Africa has to move with the age in which we find itself in order to survive. What I'm alluding to here is the establishment of an international priesthood of liberation and an institute to maintain that priesthood. So he calls the leadership guild, if you will, or society, who will be responsible for cultivating generations of youth who understand that the goal is to responsibly manage and handle power, our wealth, and resources. Dr. John Henry Clark calls that an international priesthood, right? And again, this is religious or spiritual, right? We understand it in a Western construct, but from the perspective of African worldview, this is life, right? We're not fragmenting and compartmentalizing life. This is life. All right. My foundation, Afro-Baptist roots, African Methodism. That's not uncommon. Most, not all, but most African Americans who have been socialized in religion in the United States um, were introduced to Baptist traditions, right? Most. And then second is Methodism and so forth, right? So I am a Kemetic Akan Methodist, right? And I'm actually being playful. Um, there is a scholar, Dr. Tracy Hucks. She wrote a book on the Yoruba tradition and African American nationalism. Powerful book, right? She researches the evolution of the Yoruba tradition and the practice of Yoruba spirituality among African Americans from the inception of the first communities and societies and so forth. In fact, in Philadelphia, one of my college friends is a part of that story. His family was a part of the early practitioners of the Yoruba tradition. They have a festival every year in Philly called the Odunde Festival. It's a New Year festival to Oshun, right? And I had been going to that festival since I was, what, maybe 18, 19 years old, and so forth, right? And so, but in her book, she says, you know, there's some folk, in fact, I think it's a chapter. In her book, she says there's some folk, they Yoruba Baptists. They grew up Baptist. Every now and then they still go to Baptist services and churches because they're family, community, and so forth, right? But then at night they at the shrine, casting cowrie shells, or at a bimbe, right? Or making Igbo, right, to the Orisha or the Agungun, right, and so forth, right? So she was playing on this fluidity that we see with many folk, not all, but many folk, this fluidity, right? And even I think the NOI was that way. I knew plenty of folk who they were in First Baptist at 11 a.m. and then 3 p.m. they at the NOI temple. Right? I knew a lot of folk like that back in the wherever, 80s, 90s, 70s, and so forth. So she's playing with this Yoruba Baptist. So I took it. I said, well, you know what? I'm a Kemetic Akan Methodist, right? Because I grew up in a Black Baptist church. In fact, the image to the left, that's my home congregation. First United Baptist Church, 38th and Haverford in West Philadelphia, right? The image to the left, right? That's the church I was born, raised in, baptized in. I was on, of course, youth choir, the usher board, scouts, vacation Bible school, right? All of that. And then by the time I got to seminary, though, I in terms of my Christian experience, I switched to Methodism, right? United Methodist, African Methodist, and so forth. I'm showing this because one, that's my background in terms of my Christian training, my Christian orientation, and I'm also sharing it that what we have discussed up to now must become imperative for the 80 to 90% of Black America who say they're Baptists and Methodists and Pentecostals and so forth, right? So in other words, this imperative, this initiative that Jaimon Hunsu or even Andrew Young and then Gay Rod Wilmore, right? It cannot happen independent of these institutions because they command 90% of the population, right? And they continue, of course, to have tremendous impact, right? And so throughout my career, I've attempted to be a bridge builder between these institutions and the other institutions where I trained and inspired me. So my foundation is Afro-Baptist and African Methodism, and even Islam too. I didn't put that in there, but Philly was a strong Islamic city. So if you seeking and searching, you want to run into the NOI, you want to run into Moors, 5% Nation of Gods and Herbs, you want to run into all of those, right? And so forth, right? But that's my foundation. But my inspiration and my training is the classical Nile Valley and Akan spirituality. For me, it was a Sarset society, the early 90s, Irwa Tahuti Kamu, the Irwa of the Philadelphia Hesp, certainly Raul Neferamin, Shechem Shechem in New York, and so forth. And so that is the tradition that I was first introduced to and exposed to. And then in 2005, Akan spirituality, right? And so for me, I have brought these, this is just a beginning point. We can talk more about this maybe, at another time or another session. But I just wanted to frame how classical Nile Valley spiritual, classical African culture and spirituality, and contemporary spirituality, right, brought into a dialogue with one another, right, to create a synergy, a synthesis for the work that we need to create an African spiritual renaissance, right? And so the dichotomy between, and I don't know why some folk have this, but I've listened to folk like there's a dichotomy between, right, those of us who are practitioners and committed to ancient Kemetic or Egyptian spirituality, and then those who are in maybe the Yoruba, Khan, Santeria, Bodun traditions, right? But clearly, as I say here, ancient Kemetic and Kushite spirituality is African traditional spirituality. It's not, and I know we know this, it's not Oriental, it's not Mediterranean, it's ancient African spirituality. And because of that, it continues to live on today among the Akan, among the Yoruba, the Igbo, the Malinka, the Ewe, the Shona, the Fulani, the Nubians, and countless of African Americans, Jamaicans, Haitians, Panamanians, Guyana, Brazil, right? Candomblé. It continues to live on in these living traditions. And what I've discovered is that ancient Kemet and Kush give explanatory power to the living traditions that are practiced today. Right? I remember the first Komfo or priest that I was initiated in Ghana, 2005, 2006. Mami Wata priest, right? A master priest, master technician, right? And I happened to have had, for some reason, I took my copy of the pyramid text, right? Faulkner's translation, right? The British, and I was reading it. And I said to him, I said, you know what? Do you know what you're teaching me and showing me right here in this shrine, in this village? You know that I can show you the practices word for word, step by step, identical in the pyramid text of ancient Egypt. And he said he didn't know, and of course he didn't. I wasn't surprised by that. And that's not to negate him, or that's not a negative against him, right? This was a Ghanaian man steeped in Akan traditions, right? So he wasn't familiar with Kemet in the pyramid text, right? But I knew much of what he was teaching and what the initiation he took me through. I saw them in the pyramid text, the coffin text. I saw it in the stele of Pianki, right? That's another, right? The Pianki stele is rich, right? The Pianki stele, he could be in Nigeria, Senegal, right? The great triumphal stele of Pianki, right? When he leaves Napata and comes and recaptures Upper Egypt, right? And takes it away from those lower Egyptian kings. If you study the rituals in the Pianki stele, you study the rituals that he engages in, right? Each temple he recaptured, each temple that he reclaims, right? He performs rituals with his soldiers, right? It's right there in the stele. Looks like something the Shona people or the Zulu people do, or the Igbo or Yoruba people do today. Today. So there's no separation and division, right? Only by time. And then so I have these quotes. We talk about this in our book, The Origin of the Word Amen. Of course, E.A. Wallace Budge, others, they were aware of this as well, right? They were saying this. This is 100 years ago, by the way, right? Of course, the British, we know, the former colonies of Great Britain is what? Egypt, Sudan, what else? Ghana, Nigeria, the Anglophone aspect of Cameroon, right? We know that, and certainly the southern part of the continent in South Africa, right? And so they were aware, right? He says, look, the modern African witch doctor or quote unquote medicine man, this is Budge talking, plays a part in every important incident in the life of the modern Sudanese, just as the Carrie Ebb did in the life of ancient Egypt. So he's talking about the traditional healers in the Sudan among the Nubian people and the Nuba people, right? And other people, the Nuer people, the Dinka people. Those traditional healers are just like the Carrie Ebb, the priest of ancient Egypt. This is what he's saying 100 years ago. He says, the writing of the introduction to the Egyptian Book of the Dead of Prayer Meru brought me face to face with the difficulty of explaining Egyptian psychology and eschatology in general. None of the existing works on the Egyptian religion explain the difficulties, right? In other words, he's talking about his peers. He's saying none of my other European peers who have studied Egyptian religion have given a satisfactory explanation of the culture. But a perusal of Maspero's work showed that this eminent Egyptologist had battled with the same difficulties in that he, like myself, was disposed to explain them by referencing to the beliefs of modern African peoples in the Sudan and West Africa. So in other words, he said, if you want to understand ancient Kemetic psychology and eschatology and spirituality, then you better look to, let's say, West Africa. You better look to the Igbo. You better look to the Yoruba. You better look to the Hausa. You better look to Jaimon Hunsun's people. You better look to the Ewe. You better look to the Fulani. You better look to the Ga, the Akan. That's how you understand ancient Kemetic spiritual. This is what he's saying. And then certainly the people of the Sudan, which I named, the Dinka, the Nuer, the Shilluk people, right? The Nuba, the Nubians, and so forth, right? That's how you understand it, right? And then finally, he says, a remarkable manner of the similarity of ancient Egyptian and modern African religious beliefs. It may be objected that modern beliefs and superstitions of the Sudan and Congo and Benin, Jaimon Hunsu's home, are survivals of ancient Egyptian religious views and opinions, but the objection seems to possess no validity, right? So those who object to this, it's not valid. So here he says the Congo, the Sudan, Benin. This gives us insight into the pyramid text, coffin text, the great stele, the wisdom literature of Ptahhotep and Amenemhotep and Kononop and the others. Right? I'm studying up one night, I'm up late one night studying this archaeological work. Excellent article, right? White Egyptologist on the market in Egypt. I got so excited, I had to show my wife, who's a Ghanaian woman. I said, look at this. I said, this market is just like the Makola market in Accra and Ghana. The same, I said, it's no different. Right? And so what I'm suggesting here is that, and even Gay Rod Wilmore said ancient and modern, right? He said we need to recover the best of ancient and modern African spiritual systems, right? And we bring them into dialogue with one another. And so what I'm saying is that this is a methodology, right? And others are doing this methodology linguistically, right? My linguistic knowledge is modest, right? I do this methodology historically, anthropologically, and archaeologically, right? And also ritual practice, right? Others do it linguistically, but you bring them into dialogue with one another, right? It's a methodology. And so what happens is, like I said, is that the Nile Valley ends up giving explanatory power to the living traditions, right? And then the living traditions bring the ancient texts to life, right? So it's a reciprocal interaction when we studying the ancient traditions and practicing the living traditions, right? It's like a conversation between the two, right? And that method, the power of that, I think is very important for this renaissance and this imperative and initiative that we began with Dr. Wilmore. Thank you.
Wow. Wow. I want to thank you, sir, Madasi Po, for oh man. Uh, now you started out mentioning someone that I absolutely cannot stand,
Who?
and that was Henry Louis Gates Jr.
Yes, I did.
And you know, he did a documentary maybe about 10 years ago, and he started out saying that Kemet was not a black African civilization, and then it went down from there. And he went to Kenya and talked about how he just started talking to people off the street, asked them who they were, and they were saying, "Well, we're Persians." And then he went to the
Which one?
went
The
to,
one in
huh?
the 90s? Was that the one
Huh?
in the 90s he did? He did the African world something in the 90s. Then he did another one just about 5 years ago.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But that turned me off from him right then. And I read Missouri Ali Missouri's critique on it, and he said, "I I was relieved that it was merely disrespectful."
Wow.
And so I just wanted to dig you on that for even mentioning that man's name in this. Okay. Yeah, but he has that part on the black church that actually my mother-in-law's watched it today at my house, downstairs. So
Well, I'm glad you said that, because again, that's my point, that the institution is ubiquitous. And this renaissance, and I argue, cannot happen independent of the black church or not having a conversation, right? And so, but I had the same critique as well as many others with Dr. Gates as well regarding the video and so forth. So, I mean, that's not really, I mean, he's aware generally, but that's not really his specialization in forte.
Certainly. I I want to open it up for. Can I open it up for questions? We got about 11 minutes left, and great presentation. And thank you for just everything you said. It was tremendous. But are there any questions? We have some time. Anyone have any questions? I see Brother Cat has a question. Go ahead, Cat Katabasi.
Yes, Dr. Faraji. You had mentioned that it was necessary to connect with the Black church in order to perpetuate the ideas and concept of African spirituality. For the most part, my own personal experiences is that that's a pretty hostile environment. Do you have any insights, any suggestions that we might think about or employ in terms of doing that and bringing that about?
I mean, let me just affirm and recognize the hostility. Gay Rod Wilmore said it's difficult, right? The quote that I shared, I shared early on. Yeah, it's hostile, it's difficult, it's threatening, and problematic. But I think which one of my ministerial colleagues used to say this. I don't care how much you know until I know how much you care. right? And so I think it's the relationship and the interaction. And even that is still difficult. But I only say that because um, there are churches, institutions that are teaching this information. They may not be preaching it from the pulpit on Sunday morning, but in their study classes and Bible study classes and so forth. And then not only that, um, for those of us who have been seminary trained, many have been exposed to this. Like, for instance, I have a colleague in Southern California, and we met maybe about a year and a half ago. He and his wife, they went to Egypt, right, with Osra Kwesi,
Yes, yes.
right?
My goodness.
He's a pastor of a church in Southern California, right? And he went to Egypt with Osra Kwesi, maybe about just a year ago, maybe a little over a year ago, right? He came back, he said, Brother Salim, I just want to sit down and talk with you, right? I'm trying to figure out how to reconcile what I saw in Egypt. I felt in Egypt, what I experienced in Egypt, right? With this tradition, right? So he wanted to have that conversation. And so there's others who also want to have those conversations, who are open, and so forth, right? And so for me, that's who I seek, and that's who I work with, and that's who I cultivate relationships with, right? With folk who are open and curious. And like the brother said to me, I'm trying to figure out how I reconcile this stuff, right? Can I have a conversation with you, right? And so, and even that, it begins with the relationship, right? He felt even comfortable enough to even, contact me, right? Because beyond theology, beyond ideology, beyond philosophy, you're African, you're human, you're a brother. and so on that level, we can talk, relate, and interact, and so forth, right? But yes, it's difficult. I'm just one who has attempted to, like I said, be a bridge builder, um, and to be a connector. But that doesn't mean I don't know the difficulties, right? Because even myself, I've been asked to sit down, be quiet, censored. You're not doing this no more. You need to leave here. Right? I've experienced all of that.
Has anybody said you need Jesus?
Yes, yes, all of that, all of that.
Can,
Yeah.
can I say something to that also?
Yes, brother, go ahead.
Let me introduce myself because I'm new. My name is Ifalade Yohanse Yao Bakan Bediako. I am from Atlanta, Georgia, and I was invited by John Jackson. First, Brother Salim, you're right. There are churches that's actually preaching it from the pulpit too. Mm-hmm. There are two in Atlanta, one called First Africa, they are a Christian church. And
First African Presbyterian?
Yes.
Yeah, I've spoken there.
Can I interrupt just for a second? Mm-hmm. One of our members that left here in Oakland, mm-hmm. that relocated there, is a drummer at First African. His name is Mahib Holmes. Mahib Holmes. Yeah, you may know him by Larry Holmes, but he.
Oh yes. Okay. Yes. All right. Yes. Because I'm a drummer too, but
okay.
Yeah, and then obviously there's the Shrine of the Black Madonna, that's national, and then there's another church here called called Sankofa.
Yes.
Yeah. So there are churches, and there's one in DC. I cannot remember the name.
Union Temple.
Yes, yes, yes.
Me too.
You know,
Yeah.
so these churches, the churches are waking up. There is an extreme challenge though to deal with them, but I think the pathway through Kemet is the way to do it.
Yes, it is.
Because
It is.
outside of the dominant imposition of the negativeness of Africa, that imposition is not on Kemet. And due to the information, Kemet is becoming a very popular civilization that is known as an African civilization among African Americans. And so even though people are Christian, they're going back and they're like, oh yeah, oh, we got Kemet, you know, we got Egypt, you know, and they go back and they're finding and they're getting some of the most eye-opening, awakening experiences by doing that. But I wanted to talk about, you know, you were speaking about the theology. Well, first, let me say, I'm an Okomfoa. I'm a Okomfoa at the Spirit Temple, Spirit Central Temple in Washington, D.C. with Nana Yao Yarenchi.
Well, you and I are brothers because Nana Yao Yarenchi trained me.
Really? Really? Oh my God! Yes. So
you tell him Salim Faraji, and then my Kweku Nkrumah.
Kweku Nkrumah. Okay.
Yes.
I will let him know.
Brother.
Yeah.
Can you tell me what is an Akwampala?
Okay. The Salim spoke about it earlier. Akomfo is the priest in the Akan tradition.
Yes.
Tradition. That's the priest. A trainee is called an Akomfoa.
Yes.
I am an Akomfoa. I graduate this summer, hopefully. If Nana allows me.
We are kind of short of time, and I want to thank you, Brother Daryl. I'm sorry, you know, you said your name and it says something else on the screen, so please forgive me.
That's fine. That's fine.
Brother Wasuf raised his hand, and I want to acknowledge Brother Wasuf. If it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have this program today. We wouldn't have Dr. Faraji. I want to also mention his market, Mama's Market, and the Sage Healing Space, 4421 24th Street here in Sacramento. Brother Wasuf, go ahead with your question or comment. And I'm afraid it's going to be the last one. Go ahead, take yourself off mute.
How you doing, Dr. Faraji?
Good to see you.
I'm glad we were able to make this happen.
Oh, thank you.
I sent you my question. One of my research areas is in astrology. And as you mentioned in your book about the Pharaoh Silko,
yes,
it also made me think about St. Augustine, whereby Africans went into coming from the priesthood and their cultures, they began to construct this new religion. Can we look back at them to see our ancient traditions and to see where some of the mystification came about? Because, you know, St. Augustine, you know, he spoke about, you know, I guess his mother's or his father being a pagan and things of that nature. So we can see what you talk about, you know, the whole ontological enterprise as how it operated from these people that were priests and nobles in Kush and Kemet and Nubia. That may be a starting point. I know that when I'm doing my work on astrology research with the Tree of Life, what have you, it you know, that's where I kind of get irritated, where they begin to demean, you know, that system. I sent you also the question. Do you follow where I'm coming from?
Yeah. Let me, you know, let me just say real quick that I think what we'll say has been doing for 40 years is primary fundamental work. I don't want to suggest that working with hostile environments should be done in lieu of this work. No, you got to do this first, primarily and fundamentally, and then you establish connections and relationships with like-minded folk. Right? I just want to say that. The priesthood, yes. I mean, one of the things. Let me say that I think this is important. There's a group of ancient Egyptian, quote unquote, magical or ritual texts, right, that I've been studying. And they're from the late period, right? And even my book deals with the late period. And I think that period is important because it's the period where we see the most impact and influence on our contemporary moment, right here, right today, right, and the great transformations and metamorphoses that occurred, right. But in this one book, right, I introduced this book in seminary. What's the scholar name? Hans, I forget his name, right? But it's a book on quote unquote ancient Egyptian magic, right, ritual texts, right. And in the text, these texts were written and developed during Greek and Roman occupation of Egypt. So in other words, this is ritual texts that were written during the period of colonization, right? So this isn't Middle Kingdom, Old Kingdom, New Kingdom ritual text, right? It's late, right? But in the text, you see the priesthood having to negotiate and figure out how to deal with a colonial settler and how to deal with cultural imperialism and cultural imposition, right? How to deal with that, even on a spiritual level, right? With the introduction of the Greek language, and then even saying correlating Osir with Greek deities and correlating Osset with somebody like Demeter, right? You all follow me in Greek religion and so forth, right? And so in the text, they're fundamentally ancient Kemetic ritual texts, right? But what's fascinating about these texts is that they also appeal to Greek, Roman, and those that are real late, some Christian, even Hebrew stuff, right? All in these Kemetic texts. These are late, right? But what's deep about the text is that their strategy was so that the priesthood wasn't destroyed, right? Or completely forgotten about, or completely co-opted, right? Which is what the Greeks were trying to do, co-opt the priesthood. And they had to do that to maintain political economic control, right? What they did is said, look, we're the originators, we're the progenitors, we're the creators, right? And so not only are we steeped in our tradition, which is 5,000-6,000 years old, right? But we also have mastered yours. So you see in these texts where they mastered the Greek and Roman tradition. If the texts are real late, they mastered the Christian tradition. There's one tradition where they're invoking Bess, right?
Just make this your last point. I'm sorry, Dr.
So
Faraji.
we got to go. The Netter Bess, they're invoking that alongside Mary and Jesus, right? But my only point is that they mastered these other foreign traditions. And in doing that, they gave themselves the upper hand in maintaining power during the time of colonial occupation, right? You all follow me. And so for me, as someone who has been trained in and initiated as an Okomfo in a Khan spirituality and a Kari Heb in Kemetic traditions, right? Himneter and so forth in Kemetic traditions, right? What is it to say that I've also engaged Islam? I've also engaged Christianity. I've also engaged Buddhism. I know the traditions. I'm familiar. I've been to your temples, your mosque, your church, right? And so now I've given myself, right, in terms of negotiating this environment that we're in, I've given myself the upper hand because not only am I steeped in my tradition, right, but I've also mastered yours. And so what happens is I become, right, the teacher, if you will, right, and the leader in that regard, right. And so that was a strategy that they use, and that's a strategy that I think continue to be useful today.
Thank you, Dr. Faraji. I'm sorry that we had to cut it close. We have another meeting coming right after, and it's the Women of Wosay. But before we leave, I want to just say that next week will be Brother Munyiga Lumumba, and he's going to be talking about revolutionary ideology coming from African culture. Revolutionary ideology coming from African culture, Munyiga Lumumba. I've had a great time. One of the questions that was asked, is this recorded? Yes, it is. It's being recorded, and it should be available in about 5 to 6 days, and it will be on Wosay Facebook, and it will be on Wosay YouTube channel. So, and I will send Dr. Faraji, when I receive it, a copy directly that he can disseminate. Thank you again, brother, for such a great message to us today, such a great teaching. And I want to use this term. It's called where. And that means great. He's a where Saba. He's a great teacher. Thank you, Dr. Faraji.